Greetings, welcome. We're glad you can join us for Culturally Sustaining MTSS or Multi-Tiered Systems of Support. This is brought to you by school counselors for MTSS and friends. We will introduce ourselves here in just a moment, but until then, thanks for watching. We hope we can continue to connect with you after today. If you want to follow us, we put out resources regularly, daily often, on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We also recently have a YouTube channel where we're putting our videos as well. If you would like to get a copy of this PowerPoint, you can see at the top hand of the screen, there's a phone number, a 202 number. You can text MTSS to this 202 number, and it will prompt you to add your email address. And with that email address, we will send out this PowerPoint. So welcome, glad you're here today. Without further ado, let's go ahead and jump in. Who are we? So we are lucky to have two friends or guests with us today, Dr. Natalie Ederman-Asinga and Dr. Rebecca Pianta. And this is a two-part webinar. So for today, we have Dr. Ederman-Asinga joining us, and the next webinar, we have Dr. Pianta joining us. So Natalie, welcome. Glad you're here with us today.
Thank you, and welcome everyone. My name is Dr. Natalie Ederman-Asinga. I am currently an assistant professor at Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia. And previous to this, I was a counselor in middle school for 7 years, and I'm excited to be here and discuss some of our work that we've done to promote culturally sustaining school counseling programs.
Excellent, thank you. So who are others that are here and part of this work? So myself, Dr. Emily Goodman-Scott, I'm an associate professor at Old Dominion University, school counseling coordinator, graduate program director, et cetera, et cetera. Before my time at ODU, I was able to be a school counselor, an elementary school counselor, and a special ed teacher. I love and cherish my time in the schools, and that really colors the work that I do as a school counselor, is wanting to bring, school counselor educator, is wanting to bring my experiences as a school counselor into my research, my writing, et cetera. And for example, I was a PBIS coach in my school, and I loved that work and really saw the intertwining of what we do as school counselors, running comprehensive programs, how that works so well with running with the MTSS, with implementing MTSS at that time for me, PBIS in the schools. And I am thrilled to work with a group of folks. There are 4 of us. We've been working together in some form for about 5 or 6 years now, probably 6 years. And we've done research, we present all over the country, and we have a book that was released last year, The School Counselor's Guide to Multi-Tiered Systems of Support. So joining us today, we have Dr. Jennifer Betters-Bubon. Hi, Jen.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. We are glad you are taking the time to join us for our webinar. As Emily said, Dr. Jennifer Betters-Bubon. I'm at the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater. I'm starting my 8th year. I am an associate professor. And similar to Emily, I was an elementary school counselor in the Madison, Wisconsin area prior to that time, and really connected with this group because of our shared interest and belief that we can create culturally sustaining multi-tiered systems that best support students and families. And that is what I discovered in my role as an elementary school counselor. I'm passionate about sharing the work and trying to help practicing school counselors figure out best ways to change their systems to meet the needs of students and families. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. We'll hear more from Dr. Peg Donahue and Dr. Jake Olson in our second webinar coming out the week after this one. All right, so as I mentioned, the follow-up webinar, today we're talking about what is culturally sustaining multi-tiered systems. The next webinar will be a how-to. So that's what we have in store for you, so stay tuned. And objectives.
So for the webinar today, as Emily shared, this is going to be a lot of the what. So we'll talk about what anti-racism is and how it may apply to schools. We'll also talk about how to identify culturally sustaining and culturally relevant schools and school practices, how to create that within your school system. And then we'll provide a refresher on MTSS, but we'll focus our attention on how we can use anti-racism and culturally sustaining practices within the MTSS system and how they're applied across data, practices, and our school as a system within itself. And give you some concrete examples on how you can apply culturally sustaining practices as well as anti-racism into your MTSS tiers. And before we start all of this, we want to make sure that everyone's aware that we really understand that within this discussion, we're all at different levels, we're all in different environments, and so things are going to look different in different settings, things are going to look different, or we're going to understand things differently based on our exposure to it. So we hope that you grow from this and also know that this journey isn't over and that it'll continue. And thinking about our world right now, we have a lot going on. First, we have the global pandemic around the health crisis and COVID. And now that we're at the end of summer, schools are starting to think about how they're going to reopen. And I think one big thing that we have to consider is the disproportionate impact on Black and Latinx communities with the global health pandemic. And also we've had this awakening around racism, and schools are starting to feel more comfortable talking about how we address racism within the school environment. So we want to consider that as we're moving forward in this discussion about MTSS. So first, when we're talking about anti-racism in education, some of you may have already seen this book, How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi. So when we're talking about educators, we're really understanding that the root cause of some of our issues in education are stemmed from policies and the power within the system. So our goal as anti-racist school counselors is to really work to dismantle those systems that we know are a problem. So if we go to the next slide, there's a little bit more of specifics on what this looks like in schools. And the first thing that we have to do is we really have to think about what our awareness is and what our own biases are. We champion a lot of programs. We've worked within a lot of systems ourselves as school counselors, and we really need to think about how maybe some of those practices need to change because they may perpetuate racism within our system. And after we do that, we start to interrogate those systems. What is it that is disproportionately and negatively impacting our students, especially those who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color? So some examples that we can think about are dress codes. So thinking about why certain dress codes are the way that they are, if there is some bias toward looking a certain way. So one example might be sagging pants and why we have such a aversion to sagging pants or bandanas. What are the implications? What do we assume about children that are wearing bandanas? And even thinking about maybe boys wearing bandanas and what the difference is if girls wear bandanas as headbands. Also, parent-teacher communication. When we're communicating with our families, are we using language that is inclusive of our families? Whether it be, are we translating it into different languages, or are we really using vocabulary that those who are not in the education system will understand? And then our grading policies and thinking about how maybe we're considering the cultures of our families outside of the school and how that might impact their outlook on how much work that their children do in school. Grading policies in the sense of, are we really considering what our students are capable of doing, and thinking about that when we're grading, or are we biased toward a certain particular type of student?
And I love those examples. If I can, to further an example you brought up with dress code, Natalie, I was reading an article by a school administrator, and they talked about the sagging pants, and they had this realization somewhat recently is they looked at the policy. They have a policy where they ask, okay, we can't have sagging pants in our school. When they looked at their student body and they said, okay, who are the students that are getting written up for breaking this policy? Black males. Black males are being written up. So this is a policy that is focused on one part of our population, and there, in the case of the school, it was Black males. But there was another piece, is he looked around, or he or she, the administrator looked around and said, who and realized there were both Black and white males that have sagging pants. However, the teachers tended to write up the Black males more often than the white males. So not only was this tended to be focused towards Black males generally, but there was also a bias in who was being written up. So looking at the system, the administrator realized there was a systems change. They needed to change the handbook and the dress code policy, but also do some work around the biases their staff have, why they were referring some students and not others. They were not referring students equitably either. So it's, again, I love this perspective, Natalie, talking about really interrogating the system. So thank you.
Yes, and we also need to think about, like, what are we punishing, right? So if we're talking about dress codes, what is the academic impact on sending a child to the office and making them miss educational time in order to deal with a situation of sagging pants or bandanas or spaghetti straps, anything like that. Like when we're taking children out of the classroom in order to deal with a discipline issue, are we doing it to serve that particular student, or are we really punishing the student and putting them at a detriment as far as their academic success by keeping them out of the classroom? And are we perpetuating at that time even in the sagging pants issue, if we're focusing on Black males, are we perpetuating maybe an academic achievement gap by continuously keeping Black males out of the classroom because of their sagging pants? So we really want to think about that as well, and that's part of interrogating a system. And then when we think about culturally sustaining practices, we can even move forward as far as thinking about the dress code. But culturally sustaining practices means that we're considering the culture and the linguistic abilities of the community that we have around us, and really offering access to the dominant culture. So we're not just saying, well, this is how you have to assimilate, this is how you have to change in order to fit the dominant culture, but as a system, we're also changing our community in order to accept that we have multiple cultures within our community. So there's this change that occurs when we have, it's just like an ecological model, the ecosystem changes from that, the culture of our students. But in addition, the students are changing because of the culture of the school. So we're trying to consider both sides of that as we think about culturally sustaining practices. And then on the next slide, we have some examples. So these are just some questions that you might want to consider when you're thinking about whether or not you're promoting culturally sustaining classrooms and schools in your community. So thinking about who can access the forms of technology in the classroom and even at home that you're trying to utilize. So if you are expecting that students are going to be able to use a particular technology in the classroom, what have you done to teach them in order to be able to understand? And how are you considering even their own technology that they use? So even before, we were having a discussion about how we as counselor educators need to learn new technologies in order to keep up with our school counseling trainees, but even teachers and school counselors can learn new technologies like TikTok, for example, or using social media as a platform to get information out. So we also have to learn what the culture is of the community that's coming in, but we also have to make sure that we teach what we expect in the classroom. And then at home, like for one example would be, if you are asking families to check grades online and not expect that you're going to check in with them every week on whether or not their child is missing an assignment, we have to make sure that families understand how to do that in the language that they're comfortable in, as well as ensuring that they have the technology in order to do that. So we need to make sure that we change the technology so that it's accessible to them, but we also need to ensure that we've done what we can to provide them with access to really understand how to do that. And then thinking about our policy decisions. Who is at the table when you are making decisions about what school policies will look like? How can you incorporate the multiple cultures that you have within the school and ensure that their voices are represented in the policies and procedures that you're creating in the school? And even beyond that, how are you incorporating students into that so that they can express their voices on policies, and make sure that you're understanding how culturally they are inclusive of the students as well.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Edermana-Singa. And our group, as we've been talking more and preparing for a number of webinars that we've been doing, we really very intentionally have changed our language from culturally responsive MTSS to culturally sustaining MTSS. And just like Dr. Edermana-Singa said, I appreciate that when we talk about culturally responsive, there are benefits to that, but I feel like that's only halfway, because we're responding. And rather than responding, we want to get in front of and be proactive and have a partnership, as she said, that's going both ways. It's not just a one-way responsive. So thank you so much for that. Really important points. Next, we're going to give a brief refresher on what is MTSS. You all likely know what that is. If not, we can refer you to some of our other resources that will unpack that for you further. But we could talk about what is MTSS all day, and frankly, we have. So this will just be very brief. All right, so what is MTSS? As you all know, it's an overarching term that incorporates looking at the student overall as a whole. We look at academics, we look at behaviors, social, emotional, mental health, etc. The whole gamut. And this came out of really this intertwining or combining of PBIS, positive behavioral interventions and supports, and RTI, response to intervention. So we had the behavioral side and the academic side, and at some schools we would have two committees looking at each of these approaches, but really putting them together with this tiered approach. What are we doing for all students at the tier 1 level? What are we doing for some students and few students at the tier 2 and 3? So using data to determine students who need more supports and putting those supports in place. And another image, and we'll be focusing on this image today, is when you think about MTSS, and I love these overlapping circles here, is you've heard the word systems many times today, is it's very important to look at the systems we have in place in our school. We know that we don't operate in isolation. Rather, students are impacted by systems, such as their families, their communities, their classroom, their school. Even when you think about society and the point in time where we are, like right now, COVID is a part of a system that's impacting all of us. This racial awakening and this increased discussion on anti-racism, that's also something that's impacting each of us. So looking at the systems that influence us. So MTSS uses the systems frame. We also use data to guide our practices. So what's currently happening, we put supports in place, and then we reevaluate. So data is driving our decisions. And so both the systems and the data, and they're guiding our practices, which is what we think about with the 3 tiers. So the practices we put in place for all, for some, and for few across the 3 tiers. So today, as we're applying this anti-racism and culturally sustaining practices to MTSS, looking at this image with the 3 circles, 4 circles really. Okay, so my question for you all is, when we change systems, design practices, and analyze data, those 3 circles, right? Systems, data, practices. When we're changing and we're building these, my question for you is, who is typically responsible for this? Who drives this? The school staff, right? We drive this. We're the school staff. Something else to think about is as school staff, most of us across the country, the average school teacher, school counselor tends to be white, middle class, female with a master's degree. And the question is, do most of our students, do they come from backgrounds that are also white, middle class, master's degree level backgrounds? No, the answer is no. So we need to be very mindful that the systems, practices, and data that we're looking at are not reflective of our worldviews and our perspectives and our values, because it's very easy to do that as educators, is to think about the culture that we're bringing into the school with us. So when we look at MTSS, what I've often heard George Sagai say is MTSS, the goal is not to necessarily change the student or the family's behaviors, but really the goal is it's a system that's put in place for us as educators to see, okay, how can we put a system in place that can guide our practices, that can help what we're doing? So it's really about us. How can we impact what we're doing and we're developing? So when we think about MTSS aiming, we need to be mindful that we're changing our behaviors and changing the system rather than focusing on changing the student and the families. So this image that you see going around often on social media is when a flower doesn't bloom, rather than fixing the environment, we need to fix the environment rather than the student. And I think that parallels so well, is if there's a problem, maybe we see an increased rate in discipline referrals, rather than saying what's wrong with the student, we say what's wrong with the system? What are we doing to contribute to this? And that's really important part of the systems lens that we're using. So the next question is how? How do we do this work? Well, we have four steps that we're going to outline for you today. And the first one is awareness. So looking at personal awareness, and that starts with looking inwards and looking at yourself. So it's examining ourselves as a school staff. You're doing this yourself, but you're also encouraging your school staff to do this. What are your identities, your beliefs, your biases, and how do they come into play as you're building these systems using data and shaping practices? How is this shaping those three aspects? So Dr. Rebecca Pianta has a great example where she mentions this exercise called Who Am I? And that's really a way to initially, it's one of many ways we can look at what are identities do we have. So if you were at a staff meeting and you're asking folks to like write down or to stand up if, who am I? So if someone were to ask, who am I? You say, I'm white, I'm Jewish, I'm a mother, I grew up middle class. So you're just describing who you are. And that's a way to kind of start the conversation. We recently got a question is how to respond when school staff say, oh, I'm colorblind, I don't see color. And a way to broach that conversation would be asking them, well, who are you? What identities do you have? And how would it be if we looked at you as an individual and we said, well, we see you, but we don't see you as a mother, or we don't see you as Christian, or, we don't see you as being a, Georgia Tech fan, whatever it is that's a big part of your identity, that that we're not seeing those things. Like, how would that be for you if we dismissed a part of your identity? And shaping that back to when we say that when someone says they're colorblind, that's really dismissing a part of someone's identity as well as how society views and treats them. So it really starts a lot of this conversation is inwards, ourselves, as well as helping our school staff to look inward. This is a great example that I've seen floating around social media. I've used with my grad students recently. This is a great way to use this as a self-assessment. So where are you on this? And the goal is looking at where you are and how you can learn and grow to move forward. So let's say that I currently recognize racism is present and it's current. So I'm in the learning zone there, but how do I get from recognizing it's a problem to saying, how can I identify how I benefit from it? Or how can I make sure not only do I recognize it, but I want to move to the growth zone to say, this is how I can promote and advocate. Maybe I would be in the fear zone where I avoid hard questions and I keep things more surface level or a little bit lighter. If I know I'm in the fear zone, how can I go to the learning zone and seek out questions where I feel some discomfort? So knowing, as Dr. Edermana-Singha said, we are all in different places in our journey, and that's okay. The goal is that we keep moving forward and we grow. So knowing, doing this as an assessment, where are we and how can we get one step better and one step further along? I should say further along rather than better. How can we keep our process growing and moving forward? So this would be great. You could do for yourself as well as your school staff. And again, with that personal awareness, we realize this is not a one and done. It's not like, all right, I got my one PD, I have personal awareness, I am done. But it's an ongoing process. I can speak to that for myself when I think of where I was 10 years ago or even 6 months ago, but that's something I try to constantly learn and grow myself. And knowing that's what the goal is for all of us, is we're constantly growing. So it's not a one PD, but it's ongoing PDs, ongoing conversations, ongoing coaching, book clubs, etc. To be aware of what are our biases, how can we increase our equity practices. So it's this continuing cycle. And not only for ourselves, we want to be really mindful, what are the identities, perspectives, the history of the folks that are in our building, so that awareness for the other staff, the students, the school community, the families, etc. And part of that is enlisting the family to partner with us so we can learn the history of the culture. So it's not us as a school imposing our values on the community, but we welcome the community in to really inform and shape our practices. So next we're going to move on to, one more slide for you before we move on. So some other resources here for you that we've mentioned some of these earlier, and you'll get the PowerPoint and you can look at these. We have some great websites as well as some books that we recommend. Okay, next we have Dr. Betters-Buban.
Thanks so much, Emily. So thinking about really building on what Emily said in terms of working with families and the community, this is also a two-step process. And in that, first we need to know who is coming into our school buildings in terms of the staff, the family, as well as the community identity. And so taking time to understand the backgrounds, cultures, beliefs, and values of the individuals who are coming into our schools is critically important. To determine if there's a match or a mismatch between the school and the values that potentially are there and what is coming in with our students and our communities. And thinking about representation. Do we represent a number of different identities and beliefs within our school? And so starting, right, with just who do we see, who do we show, who do we highlight on our bulletin boards, in our classrooms, with our guest speakers. How are we learning more about that, about who is coming into our school buildings? The second step is really thinking about how are we involving the families and communities within the work that we're doing. So you can see the graphic really says having a family advisory council. So thinking about, particularly when we're creating the systems that are in place with our multi-tiered systems of support, do we allow families and community to have an impact? Do they have a voice in terms of the expectations that we are putting in place for our students and our staff? What about the acknowledgements? How are we acknowledging positive behaviors and the good work that we're seeing? And the protocols and the discipline procedures. Is there any voice? I know it can be a struggle. I know both from the perspective of being within a school as well as having children in a school, it can be difficult to get the voice of parents in. And we need to make sure that the systems that we're building actually take into consideration the perspectives of many. So that may, at the very least, perhaps have family members involved on our MTSS teams. That's a good first step. And sometimes that can be problematic in that I know myself, I've served on a school mental health team in the past as a parent representative. And even me with being well-versed in education in schools, and this is kind of my life, I felt as though I were an outsider at times because they would be referring to acronyms I was not familiar with. They were referring to situations, to things that were happening in the school. And so sometimes I didn't necessarily feel like I had a perspective that was worth sharing. So how else can we gain family and community perspective? One way to do that is to actually have a council where we bring families in, but we ask them for their expertise. They are a guiding force where we get community and family members together and they can tell us, here's what I'm noticing, here's what I'm seeing, this is what I think, rather than trying to have them fit within an existing system that's already there within our schools. Within that advisory council, we could have them review data. I know of some school districts, some schools that do this, and they actually provide that and they say, so what is this data saying to you? And we're going to talk about data in just a second, but to start to identify different root causes. I think sometimes when we're within a system, within schools, we start to see problems in very specific ways. So let's bring in different perspectives. Let's provide that data. What do you see? What do you think might be going on? It can be a really powerful way to change systems and our response. So to do that, we need to examine school systems and our practices. So part of bringing that community perspective in can be helpful in showing us what some of our biases might be. And we really need to take a hard look at our MTSS systems for implicit bias and privilege of the dominant culture. The expectations, the acknowledgements, the routines, the discipline processes, etc. I recall an example when I was working on our PBIS team, our leadership team, and having teachers really well-intentioned thinking about how we should be teaching all of our students manners, and bringing in a magazine article, the top 10 manners all students need, and wanting to translate that into some of the PBIS expectations that we were teaching all of our students, until we really examined those for bias. And there was bias within those. You need to look people in the eye. There was something about eating quickly and quietly. I mean, it was all very much rooted in middle class values. And so making sure that we are asking those questions as members of the team. And as Natalie said earlier, examining those policies and procedures for racism, sexism, ableism, classism, all of those things. It requires intentionality. And in terms of doing that, we get to think about, so what are our goals? What are we aiming to do within our MTSS systems? Really thinking about moving beyond order, moving beyond compliance, moving beyond having all students walking neatly down the hallway in a row, and thinking about what are our goals as a community? What is our school community? What type of a place do we want this to be for all students and families? Thinking about then, for our school expectations, thinking about mastery, belonging, generosity, rather than we want everybody to just be kind of fit into a certain box. And one of those examples, Natalie was going to share, related to homework.
Yeah, and thank you, Jen. So, when we're thinking about compliance versus mastery, one example we can think about is the idea of homework and how we conceptualize homework. So while I was working in a school, one of the concerns was that students were not turning in assignments on time, or they would not complete an assignment, and so then it would become homework. And as we started to discuss with our families and even our students, within our community, we did have some students that culturally it was not thought of that schoolwork comes home. So when they're at home, and this was particularly my Latina students that I worked with, when they're at home, the expectation is that they have church obligations. They were in middle school, so they were going through the confirmation and confirmation classes. And in addition to that, they also have younger siblings that they have to take care of while their parents might be at work or maybe busy doing other things around the house. So they were, as soon as they came home, expected to start that shift from I am a student to I am part of the family. So the expectation of having them come in and do homework and be able to complete something and then be able to turn it in the next day to their teacher was a mismatch with what the culture was at the school. So there was this confusion. And then we started to question, well, is this really about the behavior? Are we giving them zeros because their behavior doesn't align with our expectations, or are we giving them zeros because they can't master the content? So after we had that discussion, we decided that it was best to have some time within the class day where they could really work on whatever it was that they weren't able to finish during the school day. And additionally, we brought homework grades down to a really low percentage so that it wouldn't impact their grade or impact whether or not they were retained or promoted. So we really do need to think about what the bigger impact of these systems that we have in place are. So if we are creating this policy, what is the damage that we could do in the long run? So if students are getting, if particular students based on the mismatch of culture are getting punished by their grades because they're not turning in homework, how does that impact them in a year? How does that impact them over 5 years? If we know the research says that retention, is not an appropriate way to, or is not appropriate for students and negatively impacts them, then we really do need to consider how our homework policies impact particular students.
And thank you so much for that, Natalie. Another example of this, when we talk about looking at our matrix that we make for the school, I really love this. This is from the Cultural Responsive Field Guide to PBIS that came out last year. But instead of just only looking at the school norms, I love this because we're able to look at the norms across several different environments. So the school norms, but also how could that differ or be the same from families? And that's going to differ from family to family. So what are the students' norms growing up? Their norms now, the school norms, how are those alike? How are those different? And how can that create conflict? So just as Natalie said, if there is an expectation that schoolwork is done at school and coming home is family and community time, there's going to be a conflict if there's an expectation that students do a high degree of homework. However, that expectation is not shared at home. And I think so often, I've heard educators say like, the parents, the families have to do their part. This is a family issue, but is this really a family issue? Like my thought is no, it's showing we need to be valuing that these Latina students, as they were sharing the value of supporting their family, supporting their church, being active in their church, caretaking for their younger ones, supporting their general community, making sure that we're aligning those. So filling out something like this, but again, having those cultural brokers, those family members, as Jen said, that are able to inform us. So, and we need to be also receptive to listening to that as well. Okay, I think Jen.
Yes, we also get to examine data. I love data. My students know I love data. I think it's really, really important that we are continually evaluating who needs additional support. And as Emily said at the start of this of the webinar, when she was talking about data systems and practices, we're trying to reframe that, not to automatically zero in on what's wrong with students, but looking at student strengths, looking at aspirations, not always focusing on really taking a growth mindset when we're thinking about the students that we work with, and making sure that we're disaggregating our data by race, ethnicity, class, disability, gender, language proficiency. Are there patterns across these student demographics? And disaggregating among our staff. Are there patterns among our staff, which may mean that staff need additional support in terms of supporting students? So making sure we're really taking a more global perspective when we're thinking about the numbers data. And I'll let Natalie talk about some other types of data we get to consider. Oh, and this was an example before we go to Natalie. Sorry, Natalie. In thinking about how we can drill down. So this data is looking at the risk ratio and noting that when we're talking about who is getting referred for discipline, this is very, very common, that Black students are over 4 times more likely to be referred for discipline referrals than our white students. So again, going back to Emily's point, when a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment. We don't look at those students as being inherently deficient in some way. I like Ross Green's work when he talks about lagging skills. We get to examine our systems, procedures, and staff actions as well, right? So we get to look at skills that we can help facilitate within our students, but we also get to examine what are we doing as individuals within the building. Now, Natalie, to you.
Thank you. And I think that this is a great segue into this, right? So we know that the numbers say something, but they don't say everything. And sometimes when we come back to thinking about interrogating systems, we also want to interrogate the data, because a lot of times our other folks in education, administrators, teachers, etc., can look at quantitative data and choose to look at it a certain way. So they may look at the same thing that we're looking at and focus the attention on the deficit. just like Jen brought up. So thinking about the numbers in the last slide with a disproportionate number of Black students receiving discipline referrals. Well, there may be some folks that are in your discussions that may blame the students or the families, just like we talked about before. However, when we look at qualitative data as well, and we start to build that relationship and have discussions and we're open and we're less defensive about data, then we can really get an understanding of how we can change these numbers. So thinking about how you build that. Emily discussed cultural brokers, and I like to also think about cultural gatekeepers and that idea of you have particular populations that may not feel safe in education. Maybe they had a negative experience in education. Maybe they never went through a US education system. So it's really important to build that trust and rapport first and foremost, and help them understand that we're not only here to help them, like we're not coming in just as saviors, but we're also here to hear from them and use their expertise to make our school better. So that happens it happens over time, and it may take some time of finding out and figuring out who are those cultural brokers, who are the people that are very ingrained into their culture of origin, but also have already gained access into the dominant culture. And so they're able to kind of code switch and change the language and really make sure that everyone at the table understands each other. So really finding those people, and that takes a little bit of time, but it's not impossible. Like I said, I did this while I was a school counselor for at a middle school, where I really just tried to get to know families and build those relationships. And then it may take some visits with folks. So particularly, I can speak to the Latinx community. Robocalls may not work when you're trying to figure out or get feedback. Surveys may not work. People who don't have access to reliable internet connections, sending out an electronic Google form may not be the most appropriate way to get data from them. So looking at how maybe you can visit communities. So Google Maps is great. You can pin different addresses onto a map, and you can see where maybe some of your families are centrally located. And then you can go into communities and see if there's time that you can engage with families and see what their feedback might be about some of the data. You can go through phone calls, just informal conversations, keeping track of maybe some things that come through your door. So if students are coming in and they have very similar issues, making sure you take note. If you have parents that are calling regularly, asking the same question, taking note of what those conversations are, and having some classroom discussions, having some real deep kind of, I want to better understand and not be defensive about what it is that you need when you're in the classroom. So thinking about those ways that maybe aren't always as valued, but give a voice to the numbers, give a face to those numbers that you have in your quantitative data. And looking at what students think about the data, and also what parents think, and collecting maybe some of those common voices and what needs to happen and what needs to change. But a big part of this is really making sure that we understand that sometimes this is going to feel uncomfortable, and it's going to, the automatic response might be defense, but it's really more of us trying to question what we're doing automatically and changing some things bit by bit so that we can be more inclusive.
Thank you, Natalie. So to reiterate, really expanding your view, look at staff referrals, look at demographics, qualitative data, and then look for root causes. Rather than always placing the responsibility on students, thinking about what we may have intentionally or unintentionally done to contribute to concerns that are happening, and have explicit conversations. we've given a number of examples throughout. I'll provide one more related to when I was a school counselor. Many bus referrals would come through. We noticed a pattern when we could have treated this, because it was from a specific bus, we could have treated this as really the responsibility on the student if we didn't look at the root cause. And we noted that this was one of our buses that had the highest number of students. Students were on the bus the longest. It was many of our students who were coming from a neighborhood 10 miles away. And it was students who were demographically diverse, more diverse from the white students who lived in the neighborhood close to the school. We were able to use data. We were able to add a bus route. Discipline referrals went down. And I know, Natalie, you have one other example.
Yeah, so many of you might have heard some of this if you are involved in ASCA and have heard any of the discussions from our School Counselor of the Year this year, Laura Ross. She has worked very closely with her teachers, actually, in order to challenge them on the number of referrals for males of color in her school. So specifically, before all of this, she was doing all the tiered, interventions with her students. She was going into classrooms and teaching them about self-regulation and teaching them about how to support one another and build empathy. And she was doing groups to address discipline issues that were happening. Most of them were peer-to-peer, issues or class disruptions between teacher and student. So it was all very focused on relationships. And she started to notice that her numbers were not going down. And so she decided to start looking at it a different way and start interrogating the system. So she looked at what teachers were particularly having more referrals than others, and started looking at some data around how engaged the students felt with the school, so how connected they felt in school. And she changed her intervention to directly work with the teachers and invite them to do a book club around culturally responsive teaching in the brain. And so they would meet week by week, have discussions, and at that point, her discipline referrals went down significantly, I think about 30%. So what we see is when we do start to look at how we as individuals can change, that we see a big difference in how students feel connected. And also we see a difference in how we perceive students. And so then that may also help students feel like they're listened to and more comfortable, and you may not have those same power struggles as you might if teachers are constantly assuming that it's the student and not them.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
And can I, did you mention the title of that book? I just ordered it myself.
Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain?
Yes. So
Yes.
that was done. So I love both of these examples so much, looking at the root cause for Jen, instead of looking at it's the student's fault for the discipline referrals on the bus, looking back at the system. You're right, like too many students, too long of a bus route. And same thing with you, Natalie, looking at, instead of blaming the students, just it's amazing to hear that story and to see when Laura changed the work she was doing and was able to change the systems and practices of the school staff, seeing the discipline referrals go down as a result, and having that book club and reading that book together. And talking about biases, like both of those stories are so very powerful. So thank you.
Mm-hmm. So we've talked a lot about a lot of things. So just to provide a summary, really this work is about self-awareness and continuing to do the work and growing, as well as an awareness of who are we caring about? Who is in our families and communities? Who are our students? Doing some of that interrogation of the systems and practices, looking for areas where there may be implicit bias, and advocating for policies that really do meet the needs of all students. And doing that by really interrogating our data and disaggregating looking for root causes, and really asking questions. It's not just numbers. Talking to people is really important. And remember that we are all at different places and our staff are at different places. So how can we help individuals continue to grow in their self-awareness and their own journeys to become culturally sustaining and anti-racist? I love this quote. The beauty of anti-racism is that you don't have to pretend to be free of racism to be an anti-racist. It's a commitment to fight racism wherever you find it, including in yourself. And that's the way forward. Again, we will have another how-to. Our second webinar will be coming out about a week after this one. We look forward to sharing that information with you. You can follow us on our website. These links will be posted on our website. We also will be hosting a Facebook Live event for both of these webinars. We will send these additional references and resources to you with links helpful to ground yourself in what's really important. We have a book coming out, Making MTSS Work, that should be coming out sometime in the fall. And Natalie, do you want to talk about your book that's coming out as well?
Yes, so ASCA has asked us to revise and update the Making Diversity Workbook. I think it was from 2012. So that should also be coming out. It will have a different title, but it should be coming out hopefully in the fall.
Excellent. So 2 great resources to help you continue on your journeys.
And we also want to say, thank you to ASCA for supporting both of these and making MTSS work and updated to Making Diversity Work. And they're both very user-friendly, how-to, chock full of examples. So you will hear more from ASCA in the coming few weeks, hopefully August.
These are graphics. Take a look. It can help you again on your journey. There's 3 or 4 slides. Emily, you can just kind of pop through these, but they're really kind of maps about what do you want to learn more about. And you could just follow the little arrows and you can find some really great information about school, about history. And please keep in touch with us. Please follow us on social media. We love to stay in touch. We really do want to continue to engage in authentic conversations with you all who are on the front lines, so that we can support you in your work and again, on your journeys.
Thank you all so much for coming. Thanks for your time. Special thank you to Dr. Natalie Ederman-Asinga for being our guest and as always a friend. But it's been so great to spend this time. We've had a lot of time dialoguing as a group, even to prepare for this. So I can feel that myself has grown even in the process to prepare to share this information with you. So as Jen said, we hope you continue to stay in touch and we can continue the dialogue moving forward so we can help each other in this shared journey of growth. So thank you all so much. We appreciate it. Okay, take care. Bye.